My sister looked at my 10-year-old son across a backyard full of relatives in Kansas City, laughed, and said, "Your son will always need help. Some kids just aren't built to stand on their own." My name is Delaney Ashcombe, 36 years old, and I want to explain the context behind that comment before I explain what happened afterward, because I think the specific cruelty of it only makes sense once you understand exactly what my sister was actually protecting when she said it. Our family runs Ashcombe Precision Auto, a chain of 6 repair and fabrication shops our grandfather built from a single garage in the 1970s, now generating just over $4 million in annual revenue and standing. At the time of that barbecue, at the edge of a long-anticipated leadership transition, our father had been quietly planning for years. My son Micah, 10 years old, had spent that same year struggling through a documented reading disability that required extra classroom support, something my sister Francesca had apparently decided, without ever asking me directly, made him a permanent symbol of dependency rather than a determined kid working hard through a specific, manageable learning difference. I want to be honest about how much that comment devastated me in the moment, watching Micah's face fall as he understood, at 10 years old, that his aunt had just used his learning support needs as a punchline in front of extended family. But I also want to be honest that some part of me, even in that first wounded moment, understood this wasn't really about Micah at all. Francesca's own son, my nephew Grant, was 17 and being actively groomed by our father as the likely successor to lead Ashcombe Precision Auto's next generation, a decision Francesca had spent years quietly campaigning for, positioning her own household as the responsible, capable branch of the family in contrast to what she'd apparently decided, without ever saying so directly until that barbecue, was my weaker branch. I didn't respond to her comment in the moment. I gathered Micah, told him quietly that his aunt was wrong and that needing help sometimes doesn't mean you're not strong, and left the party early. But I spent the following weeks unable to stop thinking about the particular confidence behind Francesca's cruelty, the sense that she was building toward something considerably larger than one careless comment at a family barbecue. I found out what that something was 3 months later, when my father, reviewing the company's quarterly financials ahead of a board meeting, asked me, as the company's part-time bookkeeper, a role I'd taken on 2 years earlier during Micah's diagnosis process when I'd needed more flexible hours, to help him understand a series of expense categorizations that didn't match anything he remembered approving. What I found, over the following 2 weeks of careful review, was a pattern that reframed Francesca's barbecue comment entirely. She had been using a company credit card, technically authorized for her role managing the fabrication shop's supply purchasing, to cover a substantial portion of Grant's private school tuition, luxury extracurricular expenses, and most damaging, several months of her own household's mortgage payments during a period when her husband had been between jobs, misappropriated company funds, totaling just over $94,000 over 18 months. Carefully categorized under vague supply and equipment expense codes, designed to avoid scrutiny during routine review. I sat with those numbers for a long time before I understood the full, uncomfortable shape of what had actually happened. Francesca hadn't been building a case for Grant's leadership readiness through genuine achievement. She'd been quietly funding an image of stability and success, using money that belonged to the entire family business, while simultaneously working to position my son, and by extension my branch of the family, as the weaker, more dependent one. Perhaps, I began to suspect, specifically because she understood, on some level, that the truth of her own financial situation was considerably more precarious than the confident persona she'd built at that barbecue. I brought the discrepancies to my father directly, not through Francesca, understanding that this needed careful, documented handling rather than an emotional family confrontation that could be reframed, once again, into a story about my own resentment or jealousy over the succession plan. My father hired an outside forensic accountant, a careful, thorough man named Tobias Reinhold, who spent 6 weeks confirming what I'd already found and uncovering additional discrepancies I'd missed, bringing the total misappropriated amount to just over $111,000 across nearly 2 years. The family meeting that followed, held in my father's office rather than a backyard barbecue, involved my parents, Francesca, her husband Desmond, and Tobias walking through 18 months of financial records with a precision that left very little room for Francesca's initial attempts to explain the discrepancies as administrative confusion. I was going to pay it back once things stabilized, Francesca finally admitted, her composure, so effortlessly weaponized against my son months earlier, crumbling considerably faster than she likely expected. Desmond's job situation was temporary. I didn't think it would matter in the long run. It matters considerably, my father said, his voice heavier than I had heard it in years. Because you've spent the past several months actively campaigning for Grant's readiness to eventually run this company, while simultaneously mismanaging your own household finances badly enough to justify taking over $100,000 that wasn't yours to take. I want to be honest about something important here, because I think it matters to how this story actually resolves. I didn't push for Francesca's complete exile from the family or the business, despite understanding I would have had considerable grounds to. What I did insist on, through my father as the company's controlling owner, was a formal repayment plan, Francesca's removal from any financial authorization authority within the company, and the provision that mattered most to me personally, a public, honest acknowledgement to the extended family that her comment about Micah had been unfair and untrue. That acknowledgement came 6 weeks later, at a considerably smaller, quieter family dinner than the barbecue where the original comment had been made. Francesca, visibly humbled in a way I hadn't seen from her in years, apologized to Micah directly, telling him that needing extra support with reading had nothing to do with strength or capability, and that she'd been wrong to ever suggest otherwise. I want to tell you what happened with Micah over the following year, because I think it matters more than any of the financial resolution that came before it. He continued his reading support program with a specialist who helped him develop strategies that worked specifically for how his brain processed written information. And by the end of that school year, he had not only caught up to his grade-level reading benchmarks, but had also, entirely on his own initiative, started a small neighborhood lawn care business during the summer, managing his own client schedule, pricing, and equipment maintenance with a level of independent competence that made the word help, as Francesca had once weaponized it, feel almost laughably inaccurate. Grant, my nephew, remains a genuinely good kid who I don't believe bears any responsibility for his mother's financial misconduct, and my father has since restructured the company's succession, planning to include a formal, transparent leadership development track open to any family member, myself and Micah's future involvement included, rather than the quiet, informal campaigning Francesca had spent years engaged in. I still think, sometimes, about that barbecue, about a laugh aimed at my 10-year-old son designed to make my family look weaker in comparison to a carefully constructed image that turned out to be considerably more fragile than the reading difficulty she'd mocked him for. Micah mowed 14 lawns last summer, saved enough money to buy his own equipment upgrade, and told me, with the particular confident clarity that 10-year-olds sometimes surprise you with, that he'd decided needing help with one thing never actually meant you couldn't be good at something else entirely. I think about that sentence considerably more often than I think about his aunt's laugh, and I suspect, given how the last year unfolded, that's exactly the way it should be.